I have about 40 slides, so that probably take about 40 minutes. So I will just come to my presentation. And but first, at Len's suggestion, I'll talk very quickly about myself, my research. My background is in multimodal discourse analysis. I got my PhD from the National University of Singapore in 2012, and my thesis was appraisal in film. So I analyzed how characters' emotions and characters' attributes were designed to engage viewers' interest and attention. And then I developed theoretical frameworks to analyze a lot of interesting multimodal discourse issues, like in comics, in advertising, enlightening textbooks, multimedia classroom teaching, and social media. So what I will be talking about today is really started from my PhD years when I was developing theories and extending linguistic theories to analyze, investigate non-linguistic visual multimodal communication issues, and in recent years in communication and textbook research. So then in 2013, I joined Hong Kong Polytechnic University as an assistant professor. Well, I didn't know this actually. I checked a bit about our history, and I found we have a very similar history with HCU. We started as Hong Kong Technical College in 1947, and we became a university in 1994, just 3 years after HCU. Okay. And now it is a leading research university. The recent global ranking QS is 95 and 40 in linguistics in my field. Okay. So my study is really about the literacy, critical literacy, moral education, ideology, social values, and so on. So my starting point is that we don't have a single literacy. We have different versions of literacies, right? And then these versions of literacies are driven by different perceptions of the world, different ideologies. And of course, because of all these different perceptions, we teach our children, our students, different kinds of social values. So I want to say how these values are reflected in textbooks, okay? And then how, of course, that is taught in classrooms. So I go straight to my research questions, very straightforward 3 research questions. First, what are the social values in English textbooks in Hong Kong? And second, from a more semiotic perspective, how are these values designed or constructed using multimodal resources? And third question, why are they designed in such a way? And what does it reflect about Hong Kong society? Okay, so being critical in this aspect. But first of all, the question, why is this important? And why it is something worth doing? Okay, so I will start with this question, and I will be asking a lot of questions, to myself. Okay, so this is a question-guided education discourse research. So I want to show you how a discourse approach works in education research. So first, background is the more education in school curriculum. So it is one of the 4 key learning areas in Hong Kong curriculum, and since the curriculum reform after the handover in 1997, it continues to occupy a very important place. And the EDB, Education Department, kind of prescribes values such as personal values, honesty, self-esteem, and so on. And then more social values like equality, interdependence, and tolerance, all these different values. We want to say how that is reflected in textbooks. So a bit of theoretical context. We all know this background for moral education, character education, and people argue that teachers and schools have the responsibility to help children to become ethically mature adults. And education in its fullest sense is inescapably a moral enterprise. And another line of research is studying moral education, infusing moral education in English teaching, especially in the second language context. And another line of research is critical literacy. on the one hand, we say that children should be taught about all these moral values, be good boys, be good girls. But at the same time, they should also be taught about being critical, about rejecting different kinds of ideologies and brainwashing, let's say. Okay, so this new literacy research, literacy practice is a set of social cultural practices that reflect the dominant values and beliefs of a society. Okay, so it seems it is contradictory with moral education, where you try to brainwash, in a way, the children, but then on the other hand is trying to resist these different versions of values. Okay, but actually it is not, because moral education requires critical distance on tradition, exposure to alternatives, informed and reflective deliberation about how to think and live. Okay, so moral education is not just about telling students what is right, what is wrong. It's about kind of providing them the opportunity to think critically about what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so I'll be talking about these two aspects in a textbook. How we should kind of perform moral education in a way that we cultivate their critical thinking. So there's always a gap here, is that many researchers they agree that the most effective and popular moral education program are integrated within the curriculum, such as in history, in science, in English, whatever. Okay. However, there's basically no study of English, as a carrier of moral education. Okay. And I just talked to Ling about science, and apparently there's also no research in science for children. How you teach children about things like global warming, protecting the environment, and so on, through scientific knowledge about science. So a lot of interesting things to do here. And there's also a practical need, because all these moral and ideological issues are very often hidden. Okay? So teachers should guide students to analyze them functionally and critically, okay? How they work, and also to be able to understand the kind of hidden ideology agenda behind it. And research also say that the effective realization of the humanistic aspect of English language teaching relies on teachers' careful reading of the textbooks and their ability to unveil moral and humanistic values between the lines. This is a very interesting statement. It's easy to say, right? You just read and read between the lines. But how? Many teachers, they just don't have this knowledge. They don't have the awareness, and they don't have the theoretical guide. So this is a paragraph from my paper. So based on my experience of teaching postgraduate students in Hong Kong who are secondary and primary school teachers, the challenge they faced was that they had neither an overall picture of the social values in EFL textbooks, nor a meta-language to analyze them systematically. Okay? So as a result, many teachers simply ignored the values. Others merely pointed them out without guiding them to understand and let alone critically analyze these values. So it is therefore a pressing task for discourse analysts to provide a thorough understanding of what values are packaged in the textbooks and how they are constructed. So what I do is analyze, how these values are packed in textbooks. So I got all the textbooks from primary 1 to secondary 6. There's 19 textbooks in total. That's what is your data? And then next question, what is your theoretical framework? So as a simulation discourse analyst, I develop theoretical frameworks to model just what is going on there. Okay, so I have two levels of frameworks. The first level is what are the values. Okay, so here I reconceptualize the values as semantic categories. Okay, in the appraisal theory, so-called appraisal system by Martin White. So social values, here in textbook we have two broad categories for social values. One is social esteem, the things you would respect, things like he's capable being very brave and being very fashionable, things like that, normal, how different, how special you are, how capable you are, how determined and strong character, this kind of being tenacious and so on. And second aspect is social sanction. It's something that is related to rules and punishment, right? So, for example, you can't shout in the library, you can't litter, and then in social propriety, in terms of protecting the environment, don't abuse animals, things like that. Okay, so esteem is something that we would respect, and sanction is something that we have to abide by. Yeah. So then the second level for the framework is how these values are realized. So this is I draw upon theories in cognitive psychology where they talk about attitude. Where do we get our emotions? That is from the appraisal. From the appraisal of eliciting conditions. Okay, so eliciting conditions are the events that causes the attitude. So I have an example here. For example, if you say she's kind, that is our attitude, that is her attribute, the value itself. But then that is elicited by the condition. For example, she donated all her money to the poor. And then that then results in some actions from us on our part. For example, we all need to learn from her. Okay, so it is a scenario where we have some events and you have some judgment, some value judgment, and then you have some behavior resulted from that value judgment. And based on that, I developed my theoretical framework to see how values are designed in the textbooks. So first, I distinguish between articulated and embedded values. So if it is articulated, it can be explicit or implicit. If it is explicit, that is basically attitudinal axis, like kind, brave, and so on. Or you can use metaphors, like she has a heart of gold, or she's something like he's a tiger, or whatever kind of attributes. Implicit, then you use eliciting conditions and resultant behavior, like she donated all her money, or we need to learn from her. And then it can also be embedded in multimodal discourse. That is, we don't just rely on language. It can be just in the depiction of characters. So, for example, the depiction of a boy littering on the street, okay, or shouting in the library, things like that. Or other attributes like clothing and so on. And it can also be embedded in narrative design. We say, very often textbooks now, they also tell stories. And we have boring film studies. We have two kinds of moral structures. One is a Manichaean moral structure. It involves value conflict. We have a good character and a bad character, and they had a kind of a conflict, and then the good character wins. So through that depiction, it conveys a kind of value orientation. And gratitude moral structure is depicting the value through character change. So at first, there's a boy who doesn't eat healthy food or litters or whatever bad manners, and then something happened, and then he changed to be a good boy. So that's the kind of character change. We see that a lot in Hollywood movies. Okay, so it's integrating different things, cognitive psychology, appraisal theory, and film studies as well, to see how what kind of techniques are used in textbooks to design to design social values. And this is important for providing explicit or overt instruction for functional and critical analysis. So functional analysis, I mean, students will understand how to how to design social values in their own work, for example, their own essay writing. And critical analysis is that they can really think about it critically and resist. Okay? So there's two aspects of critical literacy, right? Critical thinking, and then the positive aspect of moral education. They accept good positive values after their moral deliberation. Okay, so I just give you some examples. So these articulation examples, you can see he's famous and brave and tireless. So that's a very explicit kind of attitudinal axis. And if you look at the text 3, this is I hate men, growled a crocodile. People like using our skins for shoes and handbags, so they kill us. They also like eating our meat. So this latter part, that's the eliciting condition, what they do in the event. Because they eat our meat, so they are bad. That's, the judgment is not there, so they are cruel and bad. That's the value there. And so I hate men. That's the resultant action or emotion or expression. Right? So you can see very often they have not just one way of construction, not just people eat our meat, so they are bad, or so they are cruel. Okay? But they also say, I hate them, their reaction. Okay? So this is what I call a double articulation that is also very frequent in textbooks. So you can see, especially at early years, you see this coupling of the eliciting condition. Bob says please and thank you. She is polite. So that's the event, that's the condition, and that's your value judgment. So it's coupling the value judgment and the event. So students will know, the kind of attitudes towards certain events. Yeah, and this one, she's rude, and she pushes, and she likes to fight. So it's a coupling of the judgment, the value, and the eliciting event. And another important issue is that, as I mentioned, you can't just tell them what is right, what is wrong. You also design tasks for their critical thinking. So there are different types of tasks. Some are simple, like this one. You can say, come and help me. Don't be so, it's just filling in the blank, very simple. You don't have a lot of choices. And here, this is you have a bit more freedom, right? So here you can say, are the children well behaved? You can say, and then you see these pictures depicting different behaviors. So that is, you have a more freedom, right? It's a more kind of open question, but still a limited freedom, right? So children would say, this is right, this is wrong, things like that. You don't have the opportunity to really discuss. And then go into, this is year 4, year 3, primary 4, primary 5. You get to discuss. Why this is wrong, why this is right, something like this. This is more, it's not just about right or wrong. You can say here, this example, Rachel Jones started playing piano when she was 5 years old. In 2003, she won the international competition for young pianists in Ukraine. And then you get an opportunity to discuss, what kind of student do you think Rachel is after reading the text? Okay. So can I ask you this question? What do you think this character Rachel is? If you want to describe her using an adjective. Hardworking. Dedicated. Anything else? Talented. Good. Anything negative? Driven. Right. Okay. So this is now the point of critical thinking. You say when I talk to in Chinese context, most people would say that wow, this is a role model. She is so successful, hardworking, talented, and so on, all these good things. And then I talked to there's a colleague from Sweden, and the first question he asked was, "Oh, poor little girl, is she really happy?" And then, we start this discussion about different values in different cultures, right? So in Chinese culture, this is definitely really role model, very positive. You have to be successful, right? But in North European culture, perhaps it's different, right? Whether you're happy, that's the most important question. Okay, so and then we talk about different value orientations, different cultures, right? So yeah, primary 4, primary 5, you start to think critically about these different issues. Okay, but unfortunately, we don't see a lot of these kinds of questions in the textbooks. Okay, so coming to the visual part, we just saw an example of embodied social values in value depiction of characters. So you can say just so there's no language in here, just the behavior, depiction of the behavior, and then you kind of provide your own judgment of their behavior. Yeah, and embedded in storytelling, that's also very often. I don't want to read you this story, but it's a very simple story. There's a Jack, he runs fast, and there's another boy, Simon. Simon, he always fell behind, and then one day he asked Simon, "How can you run so fast?" And Jack told him that because I always eat healthy food, I always exercise, and then Simon was thoughtful. Right? So you can see he looked thoughtful, and then 3 months later, he ran faster. Okay, so you see, you tell a story. You don't tell them to eat healthy food. You tell them that if you eat healthy food, you will run faster. Okay, so that's a mythopoiesis, right? So if you eat healthy food, you exercise, you don't necessarily run faster, right? But they give you this illusion. It's like advertisement, right? If you use this product, you will be popular, something like that, right? So, but if you use that product, you will still be you, right? So that's the kind of mythopoiesis, right? So it tells a story. It constructs a version of reality that if you do something, something will happen. Okay, so there's also a lot of such storytelling. Of course, it's multimodal storytelling. There are characters. You see a depiction of the running scenario and so on. Yeah. Okay. So now I have developed a theoretical framework. You can see I have illustrated it through typical examples. So what do I do next? So well, actually, some research they stop here, being very qualitative and developing a theoretical framework. Well, what I did was going empirical. So if you remember, I said I've got 19 textbooks. So I have to analyze all of them. I developed this theory, so I use this to really do discourse analysis, kind of analyzing the content. So we have research assistants during 3-4 months' time. We analyzed all the textbooks. So I will now talk about the quantitative analysis and findings. So after doing all this analysis, this coding, according to the categories in the theoretical framework, we get this table. Okay? But then the question for me was what is the problem with the table? So a problem is apparently it's a lot of data and we don't really see the patterns. Okay? So what I did was just a simple method of visualization. That's changing tables to figures, right? So you see something here very clearly. So for example, here the distribution of social values from P1 to secondary 6. You can see the rise it reaches a peak, most values at P5 and then declines here. So that's very interesting. And then in terms of the distribution of positive and negative values, we can also say there are more positive values, but negative values increase from P1 to P6, and then gradually decreases. Yeah, and then the distribution of social esteem and social sanction. That's also an interesting pattern. You can see social sanction we mentioned is about following rules and being good citizens, don't shout in the library, don't spit, and so on. And social esteem about being brave, being strong characters, and being tenacious, and so on. Okay, so you can say the textbooks they are really more concerned about educating good citizens. Okay, as long as you don't spit. Whether you are brave or not, we don't care, right? So that's it's more about citizenship or civic education. It's not really character education as in some countries. So that's later I will discuss these two differences: citizenship education and character education in social values education. And then there's another interesting change of tenacity and capacity. We can see at the early primary years it's more about capacity. That is, students are told that you are capable of anything. Basically, if you have children, if they're 3 or 4 years old, if they make very, very little progress, we will praise them. We say, oh, you are great, you are the best, things like that, right? So even if they can go to the toilet themselves, they can walk themselves, we will say, great, But then gradually they will realize that, well, actually that is not great. Everybody can walk, right? So then you realize that you are just a common, ordinary person. Then you have to be tenacious. You have to be kind of strong enough, to know that you are not the best, okay, and still kind of live on, right? So right, so we have a lot of tenacity education in early secondary years, where students were teenagers, facing a lot of pressure, and parents they suddenly feel that their parents are not kind of that fond of them anymore. So all this kind of pressure and stress, and then this is more kind of a tenacity education about this being strong and being determined and so on. Yeah, suck it up, right? So things like that. Yeah, right. And then last pattern, I'll not talk about all of them, but just some salient interesting patterns. And last one is the distribution of personal and social propriety. That's also a very clear pattern. At P1, you see a very clear personal issues like don't litter, don't shout, and personal hygiene, and so on. And then gradually it goes through the interpersonal domain. So it's interesting from personal through interpersonal to be polite and don't be late, things like that, and then to the broad social issues like protecting animals and helping poor children in Africa, things like that. Okay, so interesting pattern from personal to interpersonal and then to the social. So now, yeah, we have got interesting patterns. What is my next question? Is why? Okay, how do you explain this distribution? Okay, yeah, we see this very interesting kind of distribution, primary 1 to secondary 4 and 6. Yeah, why? What does that reflect about Hong Kong society and about education in general? So we find that a pattern actually reflects the moral state theory of Piaget and Kronberg. I'm sure you're all familiar with this moral stage theory. Children's moral development, right, from being selfish, egocentricity, whatever, yeah, to rational, objective attitudes towards moral issues in respect of moral law, and driven by finally the social, the altruistic concern for the good of others. So then his follower, Kronberger, we have these 3 stages: pre-conventional, that's the kind of selfish, self-centered stage, and then conventional, where self-interest is subordinated to the interest of shared relationship and then of the society itself. So children learn to respect and conform to social standards and conventions. That's why we see so many social sanctions, right? And also we have more values at P5, P6. That's just the conventional morality stage, right? 5 to 10 years old. So we see an increase. We see the more social sanctions. And then finally, to the post-conventional stage, they learn to be concerned about the larger society, and they begin to reason more abstractly about right and wrong, and they think about the moral, kind of universal moral obligations. So we say at secondary level, there are more values related to the kind of protecting animals and things that are social propriety. Yeah. Okay. So that partially explained the patterns of distribution, which is a typical kind of discourse approach. You do analysis. You have a theory. You do the analysis. You get a result, and you explain the pattern. But then the final question is, so what? What is the value? Why are we doing all this? Okay. So I'll quickly talk about the application, the kind of implications of the study. So first, from the perspective of textbook design, we can say that generally the authors observe this curriculum guide and unconsciously incorporate social values in a systematic way, presumably following this Piaget and Kornberg kind of theory. That's very clear. We see a pattern. But in other textbooks we look at, we don't see any pattern. Okay? So like, for example, in mainland China, where English is not considered as a carrier of moral and social values education, we see it's just a mess. We don't see patterns. Okay, so then this research could be used to inform textbook designers, writers. How you really systematically build values into English textbooks. And then in terms of how it is constructed, we see the use of visual images is limited. It's still very kind of traditional. There are images, but they're mostly cartoons. Okay? There are no real life scenarios depicted, like there's a person littering on the street, things like that. Okay? So they could increase the values embedded in authentic images with more complex visual design and storytelling. Okay? We know the use of the selection of characters. How do you depict the characters, the kinds of camera angle you use, and the kinds of composition. All these very complex visual kind of storytelling and visual depiction, they are not really fully used. And another issue that I mentioned earlier is about the information, providing information and indoctrination versus providing opportunity for their critical thinking. Okay? Designing learning tasks for them to kind of reason rationally. All right, so this is what I wrote. Rather than directly telling students what is right and what is wrong, textbooks can use real life situations. For example, pictures, videos, and now especially I'll talk about this later. We have a lot of multimedia classroom teaching materials, videos, and things are so handy. We could incorporate that into our classroom as well and ask students to discuss or debate, right? Rather than just tell them this is right, this is wrong. And of course, in Hong Kong, where task-based language teaching is promoted, we can design different tasks, different kinds of tasks, from information gaps, just like filling in blanks, and reasoning gaps and opinion gaps, these discussions and debates and so on, to reason about moral issues rather than just telling them. Okay, so that's how you teach this moral education. And in terms of what to teach, we also say that people criticize, Hong Kong and China in general, that is more about brainwashing. And that's also why there's a huge protest in Hong Kong a few years ago, where they introduced the moral and national education element in the curriculum, and then that was shelved, and now it's still not implemented. So we say that they are more concerned with promoting civic duties and really kind of educating obedient citizens rather than cultivating student characters, personality, and critical thinking. And that is what actually when I submit this paper, the reviewer kind of pointed out that and suggested that I should highlight more about this my critical stance on moral education. How it relates to critical thinking. And it is not that important for me to be critical in this paper, but the point is that I provide an explicit framework for teachers to understand that all these values, they are designed. Okay? So you understand that, okay, these are the ways to design these social values, and then you just spell it out for students, and they would not take it for granted. They say, okay, just like advertisements, right? So if you understand all these kind of persuasive mechanisms, you will not be easily, persuaded, right? You understand that this is all, their tricks. Okay? So the important thing is that we understand this constructedness of values in the textbooks and how this is constructed, and to kind of deconstruct it. Okay. Yeah, right. So that's for textbooks. Many people are concerned with these kind of docile citizens who respect rules and authorities but lack other essential values and qualities as a modern citizen. Okay, and for classroom teaching, well, yes, we talk about these two aspects. First, overt instruction should be provided for citizens students to recognize and accept these basic codes of behavior, some universal codes of behavior, like what I mentioned, litter and shouting, elaborating, things like that. And then, on the other hand, students should also be gradually guided to identify social values, including the author's implicit attitudes, ideological manipulations, etc., and make independent moral judgments based on the represented events and behavior. And here, a quote from Kathy Mills in a multiliteracy classroom: as most children and youth today have ready access to a host of consumer-driven data, these teachers should provide necessary tools to facilitate critical thinking. So it's not about me being critical, it's about students being able to be critical if they understand, this design process. Okay? And it's not just about the textbook, for us, it's about the other kind of commercial materials, and like advertisements, for example. You will say this, how they work. So that's, in terms of teachers, then this is not, this is kind of beyond the project, but teachers should understand what values to teach at what level. When now Hong Kong school teachers are required to do that, like year 2, year 3, you have these 4 or 5 values, and then how to teach. How do you kind of discursively pack them? Right, and in actual teaching, so now coming to the question really beyond the scope of my research is now we have a meta language to understand moral values in textbooks, which is also applicable to other teaching materials. The next question is how to teach in the actual classroom. So this is another paper I've done using the multiliteracy pedagogy to kind of intervene and to design a classroom. We'll not talk about this now. Okay, so now I come to my summary. You can see I've asked myself a lot of questions, starting from the first question, that is what, right? What is the phenomenon that you look at? So this is we can say it is from the society. I did this study because of the huge protest in Hong Kong about moral and national education, and it is contextualized in this particular context where nobody has done such research, and I also problematize the current situation because there's no research, so as many criticism and not effective kind of social values education and so on. So it's something that is worth doing. That's my start point of this education discourse research. And then as a discourse analyst, a simultation, I developed theoretical frameworks, discourse analysis frameworks to understand how values are designed in textbooks. So I have done 2 things. First is I developed the theoretical framework. I illustrated some examples, but then I also apply this framework to the whole 19 textbooks being empirical in my research. And you can also say that I have been really cross-disciplinary by bringing in appraisal theory in discourse analysis, linguistics, and cognitive psychology, and film studies as well to really come up with a comprehensive framework to model the design choices. Okay. And then the next step is to explain why they are designed in such a way. What does that reflect about broader social, cultural, educational, psychological issues? Okay, so that is from the text to kind of the broader social context out of the text. Okay, and here you also need another theory to explain. Sometimes, if you are doing an educational issue, then perhaps educational psychology, developmental psychology, education, whatever theories, right? So this is another opportunity for being cross-disciplinary. Okay, so I talk with Claire and Len last night for dinner. So the hallmark of this research center is being cross-disciplinary. So you can see in discourse research, we can also bring in a lot of different theories combined with, social, cultural, psychological, education, discourse, whatever theories. Okay, and they work well together. One is doing the descriptive work, and one is doing the explanatory work. Okay, and finally, go back to the society explanation. Okay, what is the point of doing all this? What is this for? Okay, so I talk about the application, possible kind of your critical the findings and your implications of the research. It doesn't have to be immediate, kind of value. Okay, but you talk about in long term how you apply in your own teaching and how other people may use your research and how school teachers and now school teachers in Hong Kong are using my research as well. So I talk about this impact. Okay, so and that is another aspect I want to highlight about discourse education, discourse research. That is social accountability, right? So I believe that is important here, but people would tend to think that discourse analysis is useless. Okay, but actually it is not, right? If it is kind of situated in a important educational context, we also have something to contribute. Okay. So that is an approach of education discourse research guided by these 4 questions. Right, so this is the paper. It's online now, but it will come out maybe next year. Okay, right, so now my last slide, what next? Okay, so I've talked about a multimodal construction of social humanistic values in English textbooks, and what are the values and how they are constructed and why they are constructed in such a way. And apparently there's a lot to be done in terms of this critical literacy or character education. For example, in other subjects, like in science, in history, we can do similar study to see if they are packing values in it, or to what extent, and how they design this and so on, and how this kind of humanistic aspect interacts with the scientific aspect, right? How these different knowledges interact. And not just textbooks, but also in multimedia teaching materials, where we have the design process, more complicated, right? So perhaps we need more theories, more new descriptive tools. Okay, so then I talked about the kind of attitudes in science education videos and animations, right? So there's also a whole lot of opportunity for developing new theories and new findings and new applications, how we can use this theory to guide the design of videos for educating children, about global warming, whatever kind of issues. Okay, and using animation, designing animation in the classroom as well. Okay, so this is a longitudinal study. We can do a longitudinal study, of course, in other contexts as well, and to say, if the values are appropriate at this stage, right? So in science or other kinds of subjects. So then I'd also talk about this issue about, sometimes the textbooks of a lower grade is more difficult than a higher grade. And then if they want to make it simpler, they simply take out all the values and appraisal things, and that doesn't make it simpler, right? So it's very important to say, how we kind of gradually build up children's personality, as a whole person, right? Yeah, and of course, at the same time, building up their scientific whatever discipline knowledge. And also, we can do cross-cultural comparison, like the kinds of values in Eastern, Western context, Chinese and Australian context, and so on, and how this can be applied in classroom teaching. How this kinds of technology in textbooks, in videos, animations, how you can use this effectively in classroom teaching, in the design of pedagogy and so on, which is beyond the scope currently, but certainly very interesting issues to explore. All right, thank you very much.